Welcome to the Pardes channel. Today, we explain Numbers chapter 14 in a clear and simple way, step by step. This single chapter literally alters the destiny of an entire generation. It's this monumental, pivotal moment where fear completely collides with faith, and it ends up resulting in a massive 40-year detour for the Israelites.
Here's our roadmap for today's explainer. We'll go through 6 sections. First, context and the rebellion. Second, Moses pleads with God. Third, the 40-year decree. Fourth, the disastrous counterattack. Fifth, clarifications and key ideas. And finally, number 6, practical life lessons.
Let's get right into Section 1, Context in the Rebellion, the tragic response to the spies report.
Okay, so to really grasp the gravity of chapter 14, we have to remember exactly where chapter 13 left off. Picture the scene. The Israelites are camped out in the desert right on the border of Canaan. This is it, the land they were promised. They'd just sent out 12 scouts on a 40-day mission to explore the land. But when those scouts come back, 10 of them deliver a deeply, deeply terrifying report. They talk about these massive, fortified cities and even claim to have seen the Nephilim, literal giants walking around in the land. So as you can imagine, the entire Israelite congregation is just struck with absolute paralyzing fear. And that right there is exactly where chapter 14, verse 1 begins.
If we look closely at verses 1 through 4, we're basically witnessing a total collapse of national morale. The Hebrew text is super clear here. It tells us that the entire assembly lifted up their voices and they just wept aloud all through that night. They're grumbling bitterly against Moses and Aaron. They literally cry out, "If only we had died in Egypt or in this desert." They are completely convinced that God is bringing them all the way to this land just so they can fall by the sword and that their wives and children are going to be taken as plunder. But here's the crazy part. They don't just stop at complaining. In verse 4, they actually say to each other, "Let us appoint a leader and return to Egypt." Just think about how astounding that is for a second. They are actively plotting a full-blown mutiny so they can willingly march right back into the brutal, backbreaking chains of Egyptian slavery. Why? Because they are just too afraid to face the battle as free people.
Faced with this absolute mutiny, you really have to notice the stark contrast in how the leaders react in verses 5 through 10. Moses and Aaron literally fall on their faces before the entire assembly of Israelites. It's a sign of total desperation and humility. Meanwhile, you have Joshua and Caleb. Now remember, these are the only 2 spies who brought back a faithful, positive report. They tear their clothes in profound distress. And they boldly stand up to this hostile crowd, insisting that the land they just passed through is exceedingly good. They plead with the people, saying, "Only do not rebel against the Lord, and do not be afraid of the people of the land, because they will be our prey." Now, in the Hebrew, Joshua and Caleb use a really striking idiom here. They say their shade has departed from them, which means the Canaanites' divine protection is completely gone, while the Lord is with Israel. So how does the terrified congregation respond to this beautiful, impassioned plea for faith? Well, the whole assembly starts talking about stoning Joshua and Caleb to death. Yeah, stoning them. And right at that terrifying climax in verse 10, the kavod, the glorious presence of the Lord, suddenly appears at the tent of meeting to all the Israelites.
Moving right along to Section 2, Moses pleads with God, a masterful defense for a rebellious people.
So stepping into verses 11 and 12, God's patience has basically reached its absolute limit. God asks Moses, "How long will this people treat me with contempt, and how long will they refuse to believe in me in spite of all the signs I have done among them?" God then offers this dramatic alternative. He threatens to strike the people down with a devastating pestilence, completely disinherit them, and just make a new, greater, and mightier nation out of Moses alone, like a total reset. But what is absolutely fascinating here is Moses' brilliant logic when he responds in verses 13 through 16. Notice that Moses doesn't even try to argue that the people are innocent. He can't. They aren't. Instead, he intercedes using what is basically international geopolitics. He lays out 3 very logical steps to God. First, he says the Egyptians are going to hear about this destruction. Second, they're going to tell the inhabitants of Canaan, who already know that God's presence is actively with Israel in the pillar of cloud and fire. Third, and this is the most crucial point, if God puts this entire nation to death all at once, the surrounding nations are going to conclude that the Lord simply lacked the power to actually bring them into the promised land, and so he had to slaughter them out in the wilderness. Moses is audaciously arguing that wiping Israel out right now would look like a massive divine failure to the rest of the world.
And then, in verses 17 through 19, Moses makes his ultimate powerful appeal. He strategically quotes God's very own words right back to him. He invokes those attributes of mercy that God had previously revealed. Moses says, "Let the power of the Lord be great, just as you have declared. The Lord is slow to anger, abounding in steadfast love, and forgiving iniquity and transgression." Now, the Hebrew word used here for love is hesed, which refers to God's deep, covenantal, loyal, loving kindness. Moses acknowledges that God doesn't just clear the guilty, but he asks that, in accordance with the greatness of God's hesed, he pardon the iniquity of these people, exactly as he has forgiven them all the way from Egypt up until this very moment. It really is an incredibly profound picture of a leader standing in the gap, fighting for his broken people.
That brings us to Section 3, the 40-year decree, forgiveness accompanied by strict consequences. Moving on to verses 20 through 25, God responds to Moses' plea. God says, "I have pardoned according to your word." But we really have to understand what forgiveness actually means in this context. Yes, he pardons them from immediate, total annihilation. The nation survives. But the severe consequence of their sin absolutely remains. God declares that as surely as he lives, not a single one of the men who saw his glory and his signs in Egypt and in the wilderness, yet tested him 10 times and did not obey his voice, not one of them will ever see the promised land. By the way, testing God 10 times represents the complete and total exhaustion of divine patience. The only exception here is Caleb because, as the text says, he had a different spirit and followed God fully. Because of the people's rebellion, God commands them to turn back tomorrow and set out into the wilderness toward the Red Sea. God then establishes the exact time frame of this consequence in verses 33 and 34. And this is a moment of profound poetic justice. Divine math, really. God decrees that the Israelites will be shepherds in the wilderness for 40 years, suffering for their unfaithfulness. Why exactly 40 years, you ask? Well, God explicitly states, "According to the number of the days in which you spied out the land, 40 days, a year for each day, he shall bear your iniquity 40 years. 40 days of faithless exploration directly translates into 40 years of wandering, and they will wander until that entire rebellious generation meets its end right there in the desert sands.
In verses 26 through 38, the text outlines a very precise divine justice across 3 distinct groups. It literally addresses every single person involved. God tells Moses and Aaron to speak to the congregation, swearing an oath. "As I live, declares the Lord, what you have said in my hearing, I will do to you." So, Group 1. For the adults 20 years old and upward who grumbled against God, their exact fate is that their carcasses shall fall in this very wilderness. They're going to slowly die off over the next 4 decades. Now for Group 2, regarding the little ones. Remember, those are the very children the adults claimed would become plunder. God says he will bring them in to know the land that their parents rejected. Joshua and Caleb are confirmed as the only adults from that generation who will survive to enter the promise. Finally, Group 3. A swift and terrifying judgment falls on the 10 men who spread the bad report and incited the community in the first place. Those specific 10 spies are struck down and die immediately of a plague before the Lord.
Okay, Section 4. The disastrous counterattack, a presumptuous and doomed military campaign.
Verses 39 and 40 mark what I can only describe as a tragic and dizzying psychological whiplash. So when Moses reports God's strict decree back to the Israelites, the people mourn bitterly. I mean, they are devastated. But then, early the next morning, they suddenly, completely reverse course. They wake up and say, "Here we are. We will go up to the place that the Lord has promised, for we have sinned." Wait, what? Overnight, they go from absolute, paralyzed despair to presumptuous arrogance. Now they suddenly decide they want to attack the high hill country and take the land, but on their own terms. Moses meets this sudden burst of enthusiasm with a really desperate final warning in verses 41 through 43. He asks them point blank, "Why now are you transgressing the command of the Lord when that will not succeed?" He practically begs them, warning, "Do not go up, for the Lord is not in your midst." He tells them that if they go, they will absolutely be struck down before their enemies. He explicitly reminds them that the Amalekites and the Canaanites are facing them there, and because Israel has turned back from following the Lord will not be with them, and they are going to fall by the sword.
Verses 44 and 45 conclude the chapter with the inevitable tragedy. In their blind presumption, the people go up toward the hill country anyway. But notice a huge detail here. Neither the Ark of the Covenant of the Lord nor Moses departs from the camp. So they are marching into battle completely unsupported by divine power, and the result? It's catastrophic. The Amalekites and the Canaanites who lived in that hill country come down, attack them, and just strike them down, beating them back all the way to a place called Hormah. Now in Hebrew, the name Hormah relates to the root word for destruction, or something being devoted to destruction, which honestly is a pretty fitting tragic end to their totally unauthorized campaign.
Now for Section 5, clarifications and key ideas. Understanding the core concepts of Chapter 14.
Let's take a second to clarify a totally crucial detail from the end of the chapter, the Ark of the Covenant. So, this wasn't just some sacred chest, it represented the literal, tangible presence of God among the Israelites. Throughout their entire journey, the Ark was the vanguard of their military success. It led the way. Going into battle without the Ark wasn't just like leaving behind a missing piece of furniture, it meant they were no longer a divinely backed army. Without it, they were merely a disorganized mob in a hostile desert. The simple fact that the Ark stayed behind perfectly explains why their counterattack was so utterly devastated.
Next, we need to understand who the Amalekites and Canaanites were. These weren't just random average groups of people. The Amalekites were an ancient and notoriously bitter enemy of Israel, heavily known for attacking the weak and vulnerable. And the Canaanites, they were the heavily fortified, lethal inhabitants of the land that terrified the 10 spies in the very first place. Facing these formidable, entrenched military forces without God's backing was absolute suicide. It really highlights the sheer foolishness of Israel's delayed, panicked attempt to fight.
This entire sequence beautifully and terribly illustrates the text's key ideas. First, we clearly see the massive tension between divine justice and divine mercy. We have God punishing persistent, stubborn rebellion, but at the same time we have God preserving the nation through his hesed, his loving kindness. Second, we witness the profound, world-changing power of a leader's intercession through Moses. One man's plea literally saved a nation. And finally, we really feel the tragic irony of the Israelites. Think about it. They lacked the faith to enter the land when God promised to fight for them. Yet they presumptuously tried to conquer it with sheer physical force when God explicitly told them he had withdrawn.
Let's head into our final section, number 6, practical life lessons, what we can learn and apply to improve ourselves. We all face giant obstacles in our own lives, right? And this chapter actually provides some crucial everyday lessons for us. First off, we see the extreme danger of mob mentality. The congregation let their collective fear totally override the facts, nearly destroying their very existence and pulling them right back toward their own Egypt. Second, we learn the immense power of standing up for the truth. Joshua and Caleb literally risked their lives to speak faith to a terrified, angry crowd, and because of that, they were the only adults rewarded. Finally, we learn that timing in faith is everything. A door of opportunity that is wide open today might be firmly shut tomorrow. When the door was open, Israel hesitated. When it shut, they tried to kick it down, and it resulted in utter destruction. Just to quickly recap our chronological journey today. The chapter opens with an audacious rebellion. This is immediately met with Moses' masterful intercession. God then responds with a strict 40-year decree, and the narrative closes with a tragic, unauthorized defeat.
Which leaves us with a profound thought to ponder today. What is the great opportunity or promised land in front of you right now? And will you allow fear to hold you back from entering it? Thank you for learning with us. If this helped you understand the chapter better, like, subscribe, and join us for the next chapter.